Hey, what's up? This is Scott with Level Up Tutorials, and in this video, we're going to be covering all about motion.element, which is going to be one of the fundamental building blocks of doing anything in Framer Motion. To animate something, you need a motion element. Let's get started. Okay, so now that we have at least a baseline here, we're started, let's go ahead and start talking about Framer Motion. Now, Framer Motion, really, the key points to Framer Motion, at least the basics, all center around this motion.element, right? We have in our previous code, we did a motion.div, and we were able to set some properties on it. Now, you may have seen this pattern before if you've used anything like styled components, where you, let me pull up our elements, have used something like styled.header or styled.div. So this pattern, if you have used styled components or anything like this, should feel fairly comfortable. We are simply just bringing in a motion.div, and that div or whatever element could be very, very powerful. Because just by simply doing motion.theElement, you are giving that element some superpowers, of which we saw in the last video where you could simply just animate it. So what can we have on a motion.div? Well, there's lots of interesting properties here, of which are going to be things like the animate property. Animate. Okay, now animate is really sort of special because these are live values, right? Simply by changing a value in animate, you're going to trigger an animation regardless of what that value is. And this is firmly on display if we head to framer.com/motion in the very first example, where you'll remember that we had this square. Now, this animation isn't doing anything because these values are all just here. That's pretty cool, but if we change any of them, for instance, the X, you'll notice it doesn't just snap there, it animates there. So simply by changing a value in animate, Framer Motion is going to know to animate to that value position. So you could think of animate as sort of a live property, and by that I mean these values change, the animation changes. Now, even more so than that, what other properties do we have? Now, one of the most common properties you're going to use beyond the animate property is going to be the initial, because a lot of times we want to set a pre-mount, right? When it mounts, we want it to be a certain value, whether that's the opacity of 0 or the size of 0, and we want it to scale to a size of 1 on load, then you would have an initial property of something and then animate to something else. Now, the other property that you're going to be using the most often other than animate and initial is transition. Now, transition is going to be where you define the properties of the transition. Now, by default, the transition properties are going to be all physics-based, and many times you want to change that, whether it's the stiffness or dampening, or maybe even the type of animation. Maybe even want to just give this animation a duration. Let's see this in the code here. If we head here, I'm going to bump this over to the side again. I hope this isn't too crunched. Let me get this nice over here, just so we can see this in action. Try this out. We have our motion.div. We want our animate. Remember, this is a live value. This is going to be the on-mount value. We want the opacity to be something like 1, right? Let's think about if we want this to fade in on load. Okay, so animate is going to be an opacity of 1. In addition, we're going to have an initial, and the initial is going to have an opacity. Opacity of 0. Now, the moment we save this, you should see we get a neat little fade in. And it's not the slowest fade in the world, so you can see it's a nice little fade in. So that's pretty cool. But let's go ahead and let's say we wanted to make this transition last just a little bit longer, right? We can say transition, and the transition is going to accept several different types of properties in here, but the one we want to talk about specifically right now would just simply be the duration. Now, the duration is going to be in seconds. So if we say we want this animation to take 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 then you can see all we have to do is change the duration. Now notice that we didn't have to turn this to a different type of animation. We didn't have to mess with easing. We didn't have to mess with physics, dampening, stiffness, any of that stuff. We just said, hey, take 5 seconds to make this happen. Now there's obviously other ways we can do this by, in fact, changing the physics properties of this, but this is pretty darn cool that in the first, well, I guess this is the second video, but the first real video here of getting into the code, we're able to get this neat little full page fade in. Obviously, let's go ahead and make this happen in 1 second to see what this would look like in a little bit more of a, there we go, a little bit nicer. You could even see if we have our inspector open, you can see the opacity values being manipulated right here. This is really cool. Now, one of the nice things that Framer Motion does, just like another library you may be familiar with, React Spring, it takes the animation out of the context of React. So React isn't managing the animation, therefore we're going to get a smoother animation. In fact, any sort of jank or anything that you're going to see from Framer Motion is most assuredly not going to come from Framer Motion because, as you'll see in some of their examples, they are very smooth even when animating many things. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about some of the properties. Now, there are going to be additional properties such as an exit property, but that's going to be a little bit more of an advanced use case. And there's a whole lot more to go over here between initial, animate, and transition. There's just so many neat little things. But one of my favorite things about Framer Motion is that if it wasn't for this font size being bumped up, these would all be one line. And in 3 lines of code, well, 4 lines if you count the motion.div, you get this neat little fade. And that's super easy. I mean, that's just about as easy as it gets. I mean, no more messing with CSS classes, enter, exit, leave stuff. No more messing with CSS transitions or transforms. Hey, go from 0 to 1, take 1 second. There we go. Beautiful. So again, Framer Motion is really based on simplicity here, and I absolutely love this API. So let's dive into a little bit more because, we've gotten a little good feel for motion.div, right? We can set an initial, we can set an animate, and a transition, but what other properties can we transform? Well, some of the crux of this is all about how you transform things performantly. For instance, many times people want to transform a position absolute and then change the position left or something like that. And that's going to result in a jankier, slower, worse animation. Why? Well, because CSS is optimized to primarily transform things smoothly via the translate, transform, scale, rotate, skew for position, as well as things like opacity or background color. If you're changing the position of an object within CSS, you should probably only choose the transform, scale, rotate, skew, translate, right? Now I have some notes here I'm going to paste in to the code base, and we're just going to paste these right in here like this. Okay. By default, all transforms are going to be in 3D, as in it's always going to apply a translate Z of 0, meaning that it's going to make your CPU chill out a little bit and have your GPU take over the work. That's important for having smooth transitions. Now, also, you should, again, as we mentioned, you should only animate transforms, but to make this easy on you, Framer Motion has added some neat, handy shortcuts, which I really love. One of my least favorite things about dealing with other animation libraries and CSS animations is having to write out the whole translate 3D 0, 1 pixel or 10 pixels, 0, whatever. That just seems like so much work to move something on the Y coordinates or the X coordinates on the Z coordinates. So to make this easy, Framer Motion gives us a whole bunch of shortcuts. We want to move something on the X plane. We can just say X starts at 0. Maybe it's where it initially is. Or actually, let's say it's going to start at 100 pixels. Okay. And then we want to have a comma, and it's going to animate to X of 0, as in where it currently is. Let's save this and let's see this happen now. There we go. The whole thing slides over. There we go. Nice and easy, right? So it moved over 100 pixels. Notice that we don't even have to say pixels. If we wanted to, sure, we could say pixels. It's going to do the same thing. But look at this shorthand. Hey, we're going to move X from 100 to 0. And likewise, we can do the same with Y, or if you really wanted to, Z, and we can do Y is going to go from 100 And just like X, where we went to 0, we can also say, hey, Y, go to 0. Okay. And watch this funny transition. Oh, there the whole website goes from the bottom right to the top. And you could do negative values to do left, right, up, down, those kind of things, of which we will be getting into. But for the most part, you can see just how simple this makes this, right? We're going X, Y, opacity, whatever. And the same goes for scale. If you want to do just a scale, a translate or transform scale, you just use the scale property as we saw in the last video, likewise for rotate. And if you want to access each of these individually, you can also do scale X if you want, or rotate X or rotate Z. Same with skew, it all just works. And to me, that kind of simplicity is one of the reasons why I'm going to reach for frame of motion, because I don't have to think about it in terms of CSS. I have to think about it in terms of, well, the opacity, the X, the Y. And as somebody with a motion graphics background, I really like this. I don't necessarily need to get wrapped up in the syntax of CSS, writing out that whole translate 3D bit every time. So this is all pretty cool, and this is the basics of motion.div. We're able to interpolate values here, of which we're going to see more examples of in the rest of the series as we get to be more practical with it in each video. But so far, we have this really very super practical animation going on here. But I hope you've learned a little bit about what you can do with this. Now, this is the second video of this tutorial series, and by the second video of this tutorial series, you can already add some really neat animations, especially to the loading of your website or the mounting of anything in your website. You want to add a basic fade on the entire loading of your website? That's one line of code. I mean, that's fantastic. How amazing is that? This is the second tutorial video, and if that's all you wanted to do, you could stop this thing right now and you would have that kind of skill. So Framer Motion here really empowers you as a developer to do some really fantastic stuff. And you'll see as we go in this series, you're going to be doing some fantastic stuff. So strap yourself in and get ready. This is going to be really fantastic. I'm excited to teach you even more about Framer Motion as we go along here. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.